Hello, Bob. I am thrilled to learn that you want to take up watercolors. So, in response to your email, you said you didn't want to mess with oils. I'm 100% with you on that. You like watercolors because you could just start it and do it in one sitting without waiting. And yes and no on that. When I was first unsuccessful with watercolors 45 years ago, part of it was I was not patient enough to let one portion dry before I started another portion, and things would bleed into each other and make mud. And so I've learned how to avoid that. So yes, there are people who can do a beautiful watercolor start to finish in about 30 minutes. That takes me longer because I don't yet know what I'm doing. But one of the things you can do to sort of accelerate the waiting process is use a hair dryer. I took a workshop from a man named James Toogood, and he said to the class, there are purists who are, adamantly against hair dryers. There are 4 of them in this studio, so share them. And also, some purists say you're not allowed to use white. The watercolorist that I'm most fond of, Joseph, what's his name? I can't remember his last name. He regularly takes out his white watercolor, takes it straight out of the tube onto his brush, and puts little highlights in at the end. But what you want to do for the most part is leave those parts of your paper white that you didn't that you want to be white. Just don't paint on them. I'm going to share with you a list. This is a materials list from the workshop I took with James Toogood, and it talks about everything, including paper, paints, and brushes. So paper, I like to use a 140-pound cold press paper. I also have, and I get that in sort of the fine grain. I also have it in a rough grain. I recently used that to paint something. I'm not as fond of the rough grain. And then there's hot press, and I like that for 2 of my recent more successful works were a pot of pansies and a cedar waxwing. Hot press allows nicer naturalistic blending of one color into another. So what you could do is you could start yourself with a tablet of 140-pound cold press, or you could actually get, I have a tablet I got of Strathmore, and it was various watercolors. So watercolor paper in 9 by 12 size. If you buy a pack of about 20 sheets, if you're buying Arches, which is top of the line, it'll cost you $1 a sheet, so it's going to cost you 20 bucks. If you've got a Michaels near you, Michaels charges more money, but then they have half off, so you can get a good price on that. Or I started using Fabriano, which is an Italian watercolor paper, which is good quality, costs half as much as Arches, but that's because instead of being 100% rag content, it is 25% rag content. And I eventually moved away from Fabriano because it got some effects that I wasn't fond of. Then the nice thing about watercolor paper is you've got a sheet of it, a 9 by 12 sheet that costs you 50 cents or $1. You don't like what you did, you turn it over and you paint on the other side. Watercolor paper, I now buy it in Arches, comes in blocks, which means that the 20 sheets are glued together along 3 of the edges. So that means you don't have to mount it or stretch it or do anything. You paint on that piece of paper, and then you use a palette knife to peel that piece of paper off, and it hasn't deformed from the process of making it all wet in certain places. The other approach is you take your piece of watercolor and you tape it down using what's called artist tape. It's kind of like duct tape, but it's better suited to this process. And so you tape your sheet of watercolor paper down to a board, and that way it will not deform as you're painting on it. And then one of the things you want to be able to do is you want to be able to tilt your paper, because a lot of times, let's say you're doing a cityscape and you've got some buildings and some trees that go about 2/3 up the page, but the top third is sky. So what you'll do is you'll use a pencil and you draw in your buildings and your trees, and then you'll take just plain water and you'll wet the top third, not the place where the buildings and the trees are, and then you'll start putting in your nice blue at the top, and you'll let it kind of run down the paper, and then it will naturally sort of get lighter in some cases towards the bottom. So then you have a sky that looks fairly natural because it's darkest directly at the top and is turning into a lighter, paler blue as it approaches the horizon. So A couple things I've learned about watercoloring are I'm best off when I use fewer colors. It turns out you could start with just 3 colors. You could start with a French ultramarine blue, a alizarin crimson, and a chromium yellow, and then you can make all the colors of the rainbow out of those 3 because you get your 3 primary colors. The list that I'm going to send you actually lists about 20 colors here. You really don't need all 20 of those. So fewer colors is better. I also find I do best when I use fewer brushes. So I use like say a number 10 round is my basic brush. I've got a 14 round, and then I've got a 3/4 inch flat or a 1 inch flat. Watercolor paints come in different things. They could come in a tube, they could come in cakes. What you want to do is you don't want to get student grade colors. They are less expensive, but basically the pigment is less concentrated, so you're really not saving any money. And then the thing you need to watch out for is you want to make sure that they are not fugitive. So alizarin crimson is a very popular red in watercolors, and it is the one which, unless you buy permanent alizarin crimson, fades very quickly. So once you've finished your watercolor masterpiece, the one thing you want to do is make sure you don't hang it on a wall where the sun hits it. But even without being in direct sun, normal alizarin crimson will phase very quickly. So you want to get a permanent alizarin crimson. When you're buying watercolors, if you get good brand like Winsor & Newton, they come in different sizes, but on the back, what you're going to get is this little code that tells you about its transparency. So if you have a square that's empty, that's fully transparent. If it's got a line through it, it's semi-transparent. If half of the square is black, that's semi-opaque. And if the square is all black, it's fully opaque. And why that matters is that a lot of the most wonderful effects of watercolors come from the fact that you put down one color. Let's say you put down a nice sort of a light red color, and then you let it dry, and then you put your French ultramarine on top of it. Well, then what you're going to end up is you're going to be getting a purple that has gotten not from having mixed the red and the blue, but seeing through the blue to the red underneath, and that's where the sort of surface of your watercolor paper matters again. If you have the normal cold pressed, it has a fair bit of what's called tooth, meaning it's kind of got little indentations in it. So the pigment will settle into these little pockets more in one than in another. And then you put another layer on it and you really get a sort of a vibrant interactive effect. I'm going to send you my big fat book of watercolor basics. It is the second favorite book I have used for learning to do watercolors, and if you look in it, you'll see some of the watercolors that you've seen me paint are actually done copies from this. And so what the artists who are contributing it to have done is painted in stages. One of the challenges of what people say watercolor, some people say it is the hardest or it's the most challenging medium. I don't know that that's true. It is one of the least forgiving. So what that means is a lot of your early efforts, you're going to do something and it's going to make a mistake and you can't fix it. But it is not true that you have to get it right the first time and can't go back. In addition to issues of transparency, there's the issue of staining. There are watercolors that are staining, meaning once you put it on your paper, you can't remove it entirely. And other ones that are not staining, meaning you put it on the paper and then you can just take like a wet Mr. Clean eraser, or you take your brush and water and you can remove almost all of the pigment that you put there. So that's another trick that sort of, handling that comes with time. When I say that this is my second most favorite watercolor book, the first favorite one that I use, I can't remember the name, but I will put that in an email message with this. The one that I prefer, or one that I like better, really took you more through step by step. It shows you like 5 stages to make one painting. The reason that's important is because one of the biggest challenges of watercolor is in what order will you do what you're going to do. So in a lot of cases, if I've got a cityscape or a landscape, I'm going to do the sky first. And so because you can put down one color and then put another color on top of that and either see through that color to the color underneath, or not see through that color if it is fully opaque, determines the order in which things can be done. And so one more thing, you've said that you learn perspective in an art class, and so perspective is one of 3 or 4 tools that allow you to achieve this wonderful trick of creating a third visual dimension. So you've got 2-point perspective, so that you've got a building that's sort of a cube, and you're looking at it on a corner, and you see it getting smaller in both directions. If you took a photograph of it, and you know a lot more about this than I do, you might actually end up not with 2 but 3 vanishing points, because it's also vanishing upward as you go up a tall enough building. If you're doing buildings, unless they're skyscrapers, you kind of don't want that effect. You want your uprights to be perfectly vertical in your picture plane. Perspective is one of the things that gives you the third dimension. The 2 other things, there's a thing called atmospheric perspective, and one of my paintings, I achieved that, where as things are farther away, there's less detail, and the color is less vibrant. It's like, kind of a misty atmosphere has gotten in the way, created an atmospheric perspective. And then a third thing has to do with color, in that warm colors, red, orange, come forward, and cool colors recede. So you've got a lovely picture of a landscape, and you've got a blue sky, and then you have some green trees in the distance, and then you have a nice red barn up close. That's all going to work. If you you had a red barn that was far away on that distant hill, and then up close you had a very sort of green, you had an old green Ford that was overlapping the barn. Basically, you've got some perspective tricks competing with each other. That green is a cool color, so it's going to recede. The red is a warm color, it's going to come forward. And so even though your green truck is in front of the red barn, you've created this sort of cognitive dissonance where you've sort of violated the rules of creating a third visual dimension. So this has gotten a bit long already. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pack it up, publish it to YouTube, send you the link, and I'll send you an email with a couple other links, and I can scan the James Too Good recommendations, but I would say you certainly don't need the 20 colors he lists. Oh, also color mixing. So what I do is I have these little palettes that have spots for my pigment, so I squeeze it out of the tube and put it in those little holes, and then I have little wells for mixing color, and that has worked for me so far. There's another approach to color. There's 2 other approaches to color mixing. One which a lot of the people that I paint with use, and I love their work, so I'm thinking I might switch to that, and that involves, you don't have wells for your separate colors. You've got little slots for your raw pigments around a square, and then you have an open area, and you mix your colors in there without putting it in separate wells. And then the third approach, you might remember my 2018 Christmas card was a poinsettia. That was a copy I made from a woman who, she doesn't mix her colors in a palette or in wells. She does it right on the paper. So she'll just wet her whole paper, and then she'll take some nice red, rich red, and put it on the paper, and then she'll grab some purple and put it on the paper and mix it right there. So that's sort of a radical approach. So I will now pack this up, send it to you with a couple other links and pointers, and be back in touch more about your future as a watercolorist. Someday we'll have a joint show. Talk to you later.